So in today's lesson, I'm going to do an introduction to social inequality. This is for the OCR A-Level Geography Spec 3.A, and we're going to look at social inequality and then move on to look at how we can measure this in data. So the basic idea of social inequality is that resources are distributed unevenly, and this creates kind of differences and factions between groups in society. We can see in our diagram here, the man on the right has a trolley full of kind of supermarket goods, where the person on the left has access to nothing and is forced to kind of scrap around for rags and whatever they can get their hands on. So this idea that resources are not spread evenly, geographers can spot patterns in that. And some of the factors we might look at in terms of unequal distribution would include income, education, and the healthcare of a population. There are other factors we can look at, but these are some really kind of key ones. So geographers are interested in how that plays out in space. So we can see here there's a really clear divide in the quality of the housing. The ones on the left are an obvious slum, and there's really high class housing here in the same country and in a really short space physically. We can also see it in the data, and it's really important to think about scale. Scale is so significantly important. So I can look at this map here, and it shows me the amount of increase in wealth in the UK between 2006 2016. It shows me a basically north-south divide pretty much if I take Scotland out of the equation. In the southeast and south west, and particularly London, there is a pretty big increase in wealth. Where I look in Wales, the Midlands, and the northeast, therefore I don't see the same kind of wealth generation. I could look and create a north-south divide. But that wouldn't show me social inequality in London. Here's an example of Grenfell Tower, which was some public housing that had some really significant issues with it, where there was a huge fire, and it's right next to Notting Hill. So if I looked at a deprivation map in that area, I've got areas of some of the most deprived areas in the country right next to some of the least deprived areas. So thinking about the scale of inequality and how that looks in a physical location and how that affects places is really significant one to think about. I'm going to look at some other terms that kind of go hand in hand with social inequality, and one of them is quality of life. It's something you've come across in GCSE, and the basic understanding is it's about the well-being of an individual or a population. What I've shown in the diagram here, this is some of the criteria we might want to consider when thinking about quality of life. And the important thing to kind of understand, it's not just about economics. It's about, are the social, psychological and physical needs also being met of an individual and an area. So that could be, is the living environment nice? Do I have good access to kind of education and leisure time? As well as, can I meet my basic material needs? So having equal rights, reasonable access to healthcare and education, but also things like, do I have the freedom to marry? So if I am a gay couple, in some places you won't have the ability to be able to marry, and therefore your quality of life might be diminished. Standard of living is a kind of term that often gets thrown around with quality of life, but it is actually different. You can see from the picture here that it's largely based on income and what that income can actually give you. So what will it allow a person to buy in terms of actual products and goods, and that can be everything from what kind of house can it make me buy, what kind of food can I have access to, the entertainment, but also my kind of personal transport. So hanging on that idea of personal transport, the Swedish economist Hans Rosling said we could separate the world into levels of income. Level 1 being where you have less than $2 a day, and level 4 being up to having $32 a day. And we can see just how that affects your transport. If you've got less than $2 a day, you go everywhere by foot because you can't afford anything else. But if you're up, between $2 and $8, you've got a bike, then up to a motorcycle, And then if you're on $32 a day, like we would have in most AC countries, you would have a car. This also affects how you cook. In $32 a day, you've got a cooker where you're using firewood under $2 a day. So the income and what it actually enables you to have is really important for understanding social inequality and standard of living. We also need to kind of think about standard of living in terms of what poverty means. So poverty means that you don't have enough money to reach a decent standard of living. And obviously, standard of living in the UK would vary differently from if I was in a country like Malawi. So when we look at it in the UK, we call it relative poverty. And so you're considered poor if you have less than 60% of what the average income is. So if I looked at the average income per week for someone in the UK, it'd be close to £500. And so if you had 60% of that, which is roughly just under 300 quid, that means you would be considered to be poor. Obviously, I can look at this slum here, and that wouldn't be the same. If I had 300 quid here, that would mean quite a significant amount of wealth. So we also need to consider the idea of absolute poverty. That's where you don't have enough income to meet even the most basic living standards, so food, shelter, and housing. And the World Bank considers absolute poverty to be less than $2 a day, so $1.25, and that's kind of what Hans Rosling was saying, in that category where you can basically only walk around, all of your cooking will be done by fire, and you probably get your water source is probably going to be a river. The interesting thing to connect is standard of living and quality of life don't always match up. So this chap here is an investment banker. He may have a really high standard of living because he earns hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. But like we said with quality of life, it's not always about income. This guy might have a really stressful job. He might not be able to see his family because he works 85 hours a week. And therefore, his high standard of living doesn't always kind of correlate nicely with his high quality of life. Another term that we're going to use quite a lot coming up is about deprivation. And this is a lack of resources and opportunities for individuals and areas. So it's partly to do with income, and poverty is very closely connected to it, but it's also that key idea of not just resources but opportunities. So this is a map of London, and the purple areas are the most deprived, and we can see that kind of in the kind of north and central there are some really, really poor areas right next to areas where they're kind of in some of the least deprived. And that shows you that it's not always resources, but kind of access to opportunities for both individuals and areas. We're going to talk about the Deprivation Index, and we're going to have a look at maps of that. And that has these 7 different criteria. So it's quite a good index for looking at an area because it gives us lots of categories. So we look at income, employment, education, health, crime rates, the barriers to housing and service, and living environment. You can see that the weighting is quite heavily on income and employment because that 22.5% is kind of how much makes up the index. So just under half of it is about income and employment. But there are also these other indicators that would tell us about a place. So if I look at a place like Oxford, I can see that there is a big difference in the kind of deprivation of Oxford. The green areas show me the least deprived areas of Oxford, but also that relates to the country. So North Oxford and Headington area has some of the least deprived areas in the entire country. But then if I look to Cowley and to the south, to an area called Blackbird Leys, that is some of the most deprived areas in the country. We can therefore see that social inequality, by looking at as a geographer, looking at the geospatial patterns, is really important for understanding a place. Last thing to kind of consider, we talked about standard of living, and we talked about space and how that changes over space, but also thinking demographically. So here's a poster which shows this white American family having a really high standard of living, and then a line of black Americans who are obviously in a line to collect food from a food bank, which just shows you that kind of standard of living can be affected by things like your age, your gender, and your ethnicity. And so these are all the kind of complexities we need to consider when thinking about social inequality.